If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll share a surprise story I prepared especially for you. The sky over northern France hung low and colorless that afternoon in 1944. A thin, steady rain had turned the ground of the American tank depot into a thick brown swamp. Rows of damaged Sherman tanks sat half-sunk in the mud, their armor dented and streaked with soot. The smell of oil, burnt rubber, and wet canvas lingered in the air. Mechanics worked knee-deep in filth, moving between the machines like ghosts wrapped in grease-stained coats. Inside the main maintenance tent, the rhythmic hiss of welding torches mixed with shouted orders. Clara Whitmore stood at one of the workbenches near the rear. Her goggles fogged from the damp air, and her gloves, oversized, torn at the fingertips, hung loosely around her wrists. She had come from Ohio 6 months earlier, drafted from a factory floor in Cleveland after her husband's death in Italy. The Army didn't need sympathy, it needed welders. She never asked for this place, but she stayed because it was the only thing left that felt like purpose. Her assignment was simple: keep the Shermans alive long enough to fight again. But for weeks, she had been a target of quiet mockery. Her method, welding vertical seams instead of the standard horizontal pattern, was seen as stubborn and reckless. The others called her the wrong hand welder. The nickname stuck. Some laughed behind her back, others made comments loud enough to hear. Clara ignored them. She had learned early that silence was safer than arguing. Still, she felt the weight of it each time she lit her torch. Every spark that hit her gloves reminded her she was being judged. Her hands were steady, but her breathing wasn't. She told herself that work was the only thing she could control. If the seams held, she didn't care what they said. Across the tent, Sergeant Daniel Hayes worked on an engine block, sleeves rolled to his elbows, his face drawn and pale from fatigue. He was 36, older than most of the men here, a tank mechanic who had been in North Africa and Sicily before landing in France. His left hand bore burn scars that looked fresh even under the dirt. He didn't talk much. The others said he'd lost friends when a tank exploded outside Tunis. Whether that was true or not, Clara never asked. She just noticed the way he moved, calm, slow, deliberate, as if noise bothered him. Their paths crossed often. Daniel would hand her a wrench or steady a plate without a word. There was a quiet understanding between them. Two people who didn't fit, both carrying their own losses, both too tired to explain themselves. Late in the day, a distant artillery rumble rolled across the hills. Everyone paused. The ground trembled faintly, and a few men looked up toward the open flap of the tent, where smoke drifted on the horizon. The line was getting closer again. No one said it aloud, but they all knew. Clara turned back to her welding torch. The heat blurred her vision, and sweat mixed with the grime on her face. Her arms ached. She kept working. When her hand slipped and the bead went crooked, a corporal behind her muttered something about factory girls playing soldier. Her jaw tightened, but she didn't look up. Daniel, from across the room, gave the man a brief glance, cold enough to silence him. For a few seconds, the only sound was the steady hum of flame. Clara noticed it. That quiet moment, rare and fragile, made her focus sharpen again. She pressed the torch back to the seam, determined to finish. As night fell, the rain thickened. The tent lights flickered, and men moved slower, coughing in the damp air. Daniel packed his tools, then walked past her station. "You done for today?" he asked, his voice low. "Almost," she said. Her tone was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she turned off the torch. She looked at the welded seam, a thin, upright line of metal cooling under the weak light. It wasn't pretty, but it would hold. Dana nodded once. "Looked strong enough." That was all. No compliment, no judgment. Just a simple statement that felt like acknowledgement. When he left the tent, Clara stayed behind a moment longer. She ran her glove over the welded joint, feeling the warmth fade. She didn't smile, but something inside her eased, like she could breathe again for the first time that day. Outside, the depot was silent except for the rain hitting tin roofs and the faint echo of artillery in the distance. Clara stepped into the mud, shoulders heavy, eyes fixed on the faint glow of the front line. She had no illusions about glory or victory. Her mission was survival, keeping the tanks alive, keeping herself moving. She walked back toward the barracks, leaving deep footprints in the soaked ground. Behind her, the welding torch cooled to silence, the last ember flickering out in the dark. By dawn, the rain had stopped, leaving behind a yard filled with steam and the sour stench of burnt fuel. The workshop was already awake when Clara arrived, her boots sinking into the soft mud with each step. She hadn't slept much. The sound of artillery from the front had carried through the night. Most of the men looked the same, eyes hollow, uniforms damp, faces gray under the weak morning light. Near the far end of the yard, a new Sherman tank had been hauled in on a flatbed truck. Its hull was split along the side, a deep fracture that ran down through the armor plate. The blast had come from a direct hit the day before. The crew hadn't survived. The metal smelled of smoke and oil, a mixture so strong it burned the throat. Lieutenant Carter, the workshop officer, barked orders from the ramp. This tank needs to move out again by tomorrow. We don't have replacements, only repairs. Fix it fast. He looked straight at Clara and frowned. Whitmore, you stay on small jobs. We can't risk another experiment. Clara stared at the fractured armor. The break wasn't clean. Any standard horizontal weld would likely fail under tension once the tank moved. She knew that. Her hands clenched around her gloves. "Sir, I can't fix it," she said, voice low but steady. "Vertical seam. It'll take longer, but it'll hold." The lieutenant shook his head. "We're not here to teach new tricks." He turned away, waving to two other welders. But Daniel, who was already at the workbench, stepped forward. "Let her try," he said, not raising his voice, just firm enough to make the officer stop walking. "If it doesn't hold, I'll take the blame." That made Carter pause. He eyed Daniel for a moment, then shrugged. "Fine, but if this thing splits again, both of you answer for it." He left without another word. The men nearby watched quietly as Clara approached the damaged section. None offered help. A few exchanged doubtful looks, muttering under their breath. She felt their judgment like weight pressing on her back, but Daniel's presence beside her steadied her nerves. He didn't say much. He never did, but he began preparing the welding rods, aligning the plates with practiced care. Inside the tent, the smell of metal dust and burnt oil filled the air. The torches hissed to life. Clara positioned her goggles, her heartbeat steadying as the bright light filled her vision. Every movement had a count. One wrong pass could ruin the joint. She remembered her training days in Cleveland, how vertical seams were discouraged, how the foreman told her she was wasting time trying to reinvent gravity. But when her husband's last letter arrived from Italy, describing tanks ripped apart because weak welds gave way, she had sworn to never weld by habit again. Her hands worked with slow precision, guiding the molten pool upward. Sparks scattered across her sleeves. The seam formed unevenly at first, then smoothed out as her rhythm found balance. Daniel stayed beside her, bracing the plates and occasionally adjusting the clamps. His scarred left hand was steady despite the faint tremor from exhaustion. When the lieutenant returned hours later, Clara was still working, her face streaked with soot and sweat. "You're still at it?" he asked, half impatient. "Almost done," she replied without looking up. Daniel turned toward him. "We'll finish before nightfall." The officer hesitated, then left again. The two worked in silence. Outside, the rain started up once more, pattering softly against the tent canvas. The sound helped her focus. She didn't think about the others anymore, or about her husband, or about proving anything. She thought about the weld itself, the exact point where steel met steel, where heat fused what was broken. When the final bead cooled, she stepped back, her arms trembling from the effort. Daniel examined the seam, running his glove along the line. "Not bad," he said quietly. "Looks clean." "It'll hold," she replied, voice hoarse. He gave a short nod, the faintest hint of approval in his eyes. "You trust it?" "I have to," she said. "That's all I've got left to trust." Outside, the camp lights flickered as the generator coughed. The repaired Sherman sat in the center of the yard, steam rising from its surface in the cold air. For the first time, Clara allowed herself to breathe. She wiped her hands on her jacket and glanced toward the front line, where thunder rolled in the distance. Daniel followed her gaze. "They'll send out tomorrow," he said. She didn't answer. Her eyes stayed on the dark horizon. The tank stood ready, it seems cooling under the pale light. Her work complete, her judgment waiting in the next day's battle. In that moment, she felt both fear and a strange calm. Whatever happened next would decide whether her name meant failure or survival. And she knew Daniel would be watching, not to judge her, but to see if she was right. The next morning began with a heavy stillness that made everyone uneasy. The clouds hung low over the depot, and the ground steamed from the cold night. The repaired Sherman stood near the center of the yard, its armor plates dull from rain, the vertical seams along its side still dark and fresh. Clara arrived early, her boots soaked and her gloves stiff from the damp air. She barely spoke as she walked around the tank, running her hand across the weld she'd made. It felt solid, no cracks, no warping. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a small trace of pride. The quiet didn't last long. At sunrise, the first distant thumps of artillery rolled across the horizon. Men looked up from their work, exchanging short glances. The front was closer than expected. Someone yelled from the communications tent that a German armored column had been sighted advancing through the valley. Orders followed quickly. All operational tanks were to move out immediately to reinforce the line. Lieutenant Carter strode into the yard, his uniform damp, his voice sharp. "That new Sherman's rolling out now. Get a crew in it." Clara's pulse quickened. She stepped forward, trying to keep her voice steady. "Sir, the weld hasn't been combat tested yet. It needs a few hours to cool completely." "Not today," Carter snapped. "It's going. If it breaks, that's on me." Daniel was already by the tank, tightening the access hatches. He glanced toward Clara, his expression unreadable. "It'll hold," he said quietly. She wanted to believe him, but her stomach was tight with doubt. The Sherman's engine roared to life, coughing smoke before settling into a deep growl. The crew climbed in, 3 young men barely older than 20. One of them looked nervous enough to be sick. Clara found herself watching them too long, thinking of her husband. He had looked that young once. She forced herself to look away. When the tank rolled out of the yard and down the muddy path toward the front, the entire workshop fell silent. Clara stood beside Daniel under the tent awning, her hands clasped around her gloves. The rain had stopped, but the sky was gray and heavy. Minutes passed, then the sound of distant gunfire began, short bursts, then heavier impacts. The men in the yard froze, listening, one shell after another, growing closer until the ground trembled faintly. Daniel leaned against the truck beside her, scanning the horizon. Then came the sharp, metallic echo of tank fire. Clara recognized the rhythm. The Sherman's main gun, firing in 3 quick bursts. Another explosion followed, deeper, rougher. Daniel's jaw tightened. "That's them," he said. No one spoke. The radio in the command tent crackled with half-heard voices. Sherman under fire, 3 Panzers, holding position, returning fire, then static. The tension in the yard was thick enough to make breathing difficult. Clara couldn't stand still. She paced near the workbench, hands shaking, trying to read the faces of the men by the radio. Another distant blast echoed, then another. Finally, the voice came through again, clearer this time. "Enemy armor destroyed. Sherman still operational." "Repeat, Sherman still operational." A wave of noise broke out across the yard. Cheers, laughter, shouts of disbelief. But Clara didn't move. She stood frozen, her heart pounding, eyes fixed on the horizon. Her weld had held. The tank had survived 3 direct hits. Daniel walked over, his boots crunching in the mud. "You did it," he said simply. His voice was calm, but there was something in his eyes, relief, maybe pride, though he didn't show it easily. Clara let out a shaky breath. "The seams didn't fail?" He shook his head. "Not even close. They say it turned the shots." For a moment, neither spoke. The noise around them faded into the background. Men slapping backs, laughing, someone lighting a cigarette with trembling hands. Clara looked at the tank's empty workstation, the burned spot on the ground where her torch had been. She felt lightheaded, part disbelief, part exhaustion. It shouldn't have worked, she said quietly. Daniel looked toward the horizon, where the smoke still rose in thin black plumes. Maybe it worked because you care enough to get it right. She didn't reply. She couldn't. Her throat tightened, and she turned slightly away to hide her reaction. For weeks, she'd carried fear that her work meant nothing, that she was just a mistake waiting to happen. Now, that weight lifted, replaced by a quiet, fragile confidence she hadn't felt in years. The repaired Sherman returned later that evening, its paint scorched and armor dented but intact. The young crew stepped out shaken but alive. They thanked her awkwardly, still in disbelief. She nodded, unsure what to say. When the others left, Daniel stayed behind, sitting on a crate beside the tank. The sky was dim, streaked with fading orange light. Clara joined him without speaking. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was earned. He handed her a dented canteen. "You didn't sleep last night, did you?" She took it, shook her head. "Did you?" He gave a faint smile. "Didn't need to." They sat there as the sky darkened, the noise of the depot fading into the distance. For the first time since arriving in France, Clara felt something close to peace. Not joy, not triumph, just the quiet realization that she belonged here now, that what she did mattered. And though she didn't say it aloud, she understood Daniel's silence for what it was: respect. The depot was quiet the next morning, except for the soft groan of cooling metal and the low hum of generators. Smoke still hung in the air from the battle, mixing with the smell of wet earth and diesel. The repaired Sherman stood where it had returned hours before, its armor blackened by heat and shrapnel. The vertical seams Clara had welded were solid, burned but intact. She walked toward it slowly, her gloves tucked under her arm, her body stiff from exhaustion. Each step through the mud felt heavier than the last. Around her, soldiers worked in near silence. No one laughed. No one mocked her anymore. Some of the same men who had joked at her expense the day before now avoided her eyes. Their voices lowered when she passed. The lieutenant, usually loud and short-tempered, gave her a simple nod from across the yard, the kind reserved for someone who had earned their place. It was strange. She wasn't used to being looked at with respect. She didn't know what to do with it. Daniel was sitting beside the Sherman, a wrench resting across his knees, his face still streaked with grime. He looked like he hadn't slept either. His uniform was torn at the shoulder, one hand wrapped in a strip of cloth from a burn he hadn't bothered to treat. When he saw her, he gave a short nod, the same kind he always did, a gesture more honest than words. Clara crouched near the tank's hull, running her fingers along the seams. The steel was still warm, faintly vibrating from within as if alive. It held. She murmured, more to herself than to anyone. Daniel replied quietly, better than they expected. She exhaled, sitting back on her heels. For the first time since arriving in France, she allowed herself to feel relief. The tension that had lived in her chest for months, the constant fear of being wrong, of failing in front of everyone, finally loosened. Yet under that relief was something else: guilt. The young crew who'd taken that tank into battle had survived, but others hadn't been so lucky. The news had reached them that morning. Another Sherman, hit twice, had burned with all hands. Clara wiped her palms on her jacket, her throat tightening. "They're just boys," she said quietly. "Every time one of these comes back empty, I keep thinking, what if it was the one I worked on?" Daniel didn't look at her. "Then you did what you could. That's all anyone can do out here." She turned toward him. "You really believe that?" He met her eyes briefly. "I stopped believing in a lot of things, but I still believe in good work." The simplicity of that answer disarmed her. She studied him for a moment. There were things she hadn't known about him. Why he rarely spoke, why he never left the yard even when others went to rest. That morning, she decided to ask. "You were in North Africa," she said. "They said you stayed behind when your unit got hit." He hesitated, then nodded. "My crew didn't make it. Tank caught fire. I was supposed to weld the rear plate tighter the day before, but the order got delayed." His voice dropped. "I kept thinking, maybe if I'd fixed it sooner. Clara listened without interrupting. The quiet between them wasn't uncomfortable anymore. She understood the weight of that kind of guilt, the same thought that followed every night shift, every weld, every tank that left the yard. They were both chasing redemption in small, invisible ways. A cold wind passed through the open tent flap. Daniel stood and poured 2 cups of coffee from the dinner pot on the workbench. He handed her one, the steam rising between them. "You didn't eat," he said simply. She accepted it, fingers brushing his for a moment. The gesture was brief, but it stayed with her longer than she expected. They sat beside each other in silence, the sound of distant engines filling the empty space. When the lieutenant came back to inspect the Sherman, he stopped beside them. "Headquarters sent word," he said. "They're reporting your repair. Saved 3 tanks yesterday. Command wants a report on your welding method." Clara looked up, startled. "My what?" "They want details. Diagrams. They're sending it up the line," the lieutenant said. "Seems your wrong-hand welding might become regulation." She didn't answer right away. Her mind was still catching up to the words. For months, she'd fought to be taken seriously. Now, her method might save others she'd never even meet. It didn't feel like victory, more like quiet justice. When the officer left, Daniel glanced at her. "Guess they're finally listening." She smiled faintly. "Guess so." They finished their coffee as dawn broke fully over the yard. Light spread across the muddy ground, catching the smoke drifting from the chimneys. The depot, for a brief moment, looked almost peaceful. Clara stood, pulling her gloves back on. "They'll want me to show it to the others," she said. "Then show them," Daniel replied. "But don't change a thing." She looked at him, understanding the weight behind his words. He wasn't just talking about the welds. Later that day, as the camp stirred to new orders and more tanks arrived for repair, Clara found herself working alongside men who now asked for her advice instead of ignoring her. The same hands that once doubted her now followed her lead. She didn't raise her voice, didn't boast. She just showed them, slow and careful, the way she'd always done it. By sunset, Daniel returned to help with the last repair of the day. Their movements were familiar now, their rhythm in sync. No wasted words, just quiet understanding. Outside, the horizon glowed with faint orange light, and the sound of hammers echoed across the yard. For the first time, Clara didn't feel like an outsider. She felt part of something that would last beyond her, something made from sweat, steel, and the will to endure. The day ended not with celebration, but with calm, the kind that comes when you finally know your place in a world that once refused to see you. By the time the sun rose again, the depot had changed. The noise of chaos had quieted into something more controlled, almost routine. Men worked with purpose now, not just out of duty, but out of belief that what they did mattered. The story of Clara's weld had spread across the camp overnight. How her wrong hand seams had held through 3 direct hits, saving the tank and its crew. Mechanics from other units came by to see the work for themselves, pointing at the seams as if they were something holy. Clara didn't bask in the attention. She kept her head down and her hands busy, the same as always. Daniel found her in the tent later that morning, hunched over a fresh armor plate, measuring each line with calm precision. "They're sending new Shermans tomorrow," he said, leaning against the post. "They want us both on the detail." Clara didn't look up right away. "Both of us?" He nodded. "Carter made it official. You're part of the primary team now." For a moment, she just stared at the metal in front of her, unable to answer. Weeks ago, she had been treated like an outsider, a widowed welder from a factory who didn't belong among soldiers. Now, the work she'd been mocked for had become standard practice. It didn't erase what came before, but it meant she'd finally earned her place. She turned slightly toward Daniel, her expression caught between disbelief and quiet pride. "Guess they changed their minds." "Guess they did," he said with a faint smile. As the day wore on, the air filled with the sound of hammers, clanging tools, and shouted instructions. A convoy of wrecked tanks had arrived from the front, each one bearing scars of battle. Twisted tracks, scorched paint, holes torn through the armor. Clara and Daniel went to work on one together, side by side, their movements steady and synchronized from weeks of silent understanding. They didn't need to speak much. They knew each other's timing now. When she needed a clamp, he was already holding it out. When he needed a rod, she had it ready. It was the rhythm of two people who had found something solid to hold onto amid the shifting ground of war. At midday, Carter approached, holding a telegram folded in his hand. "Whitmore," he said, "message came through for you. It's from stateside." Clara hesitated, wiping her gloves on her apron before taking it. Her stomach tightened as she opened it, the crisp paper trembling slightly between her fingers. The message was short. Her husband's unit had been officially confirmed lost, their remains recovered. His name would be honored in a memorial list. For a long moment, she didn't move. She had known it already, deep down, but seeing it written made the truth heavier. Daniel watched her quietly, saying nothing until she folded the paper and slipped it into her pocket. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "It just feels final." He understood that look. The war had taken from both of them family, friends, pieces of themselves they'd never get back. But standing there in that tent, surrounded by the sound of machines and men working to rebuild what the world kept breaking, she realized that not everything was gone. Some things could be made whole again. Not perfect, not the same, but strong enough to hold. That evening, when the workday ended, the yard was bathed in the orange light of a calm sunset. The smell of oil hung thick, but the air felt lighter than usual. Clara stood beside the repaired Sherman from the battle, the one with her famous welds, now cleaned and ready for redeployment. She rested a hand against the armor, the metal warm from the day's heat. It wasn't pride she felt, it was peace. Daniel joined her, carrying 2 tin cups of coffee. He handed her one without a word. They stood together, watching the steam rise between them as the last of the daylight faded. Around them, soldiers laughed softly, tired but alive. The camp had the rare sound of quiet. No shelling, no orders, just the hum of cooling engines and the faint rustle of wind through the canvas. Clara broke the silence first. "When this is over," she said, "what will you do?" Daniel took a slow breath, thinking, "Haven't decided. Maybe I'll fix something that isn't meant to be destroyed for once." She smiled faintly. "That sounds good. And you?" he asked. "I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe build something that lasts." For a while they didn't speak. The quiet between them said enough about what they'd lost, what they'd built, and what they'd become to each other. As night settled over the depot, the sound of metal cooling filled the air, the slow, soft creak of steel contracting after a day's heat. Clara listened to it with a calm she hadn't known since before the war. For once, there were no doubts, no fear of breaking, no voices mocking her. Just the steady, quiet rhythm of work done right and the comfort of someone beside her who understood. When the lights dimmed and the yard fell silent, Daniel rose from his seat on the crate and extended a hand to her. "Come on," he said. "We'll start again tomorrow." She took his hand and stood, her fingers closing around his, the gesture simple but full of promise. Together, they walked through the cooling air toward the tents, leaving the yard behind. Two people shaped by loss, bound by resilience, and carried forward by the work that had saved them both. The war wasn't over, but their fight, the one inside them, finally was. And in that quiet, with the glow of steel fading behind them, their story came to rest in peace.